Good morning. Welcome to our second lesson in the study on the book of Jude. Last time we talked about when the book was written, and as I mentioned then, most authorities seem to consider that it was written either in the mid-60s AD, before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and at the same time approximately that the second Peter was written, especially the second chapter. Others say that it was written toward the end of the 70s, at the same time that influences were being made to align the church more with the political reality of the day, and that this happened during that period of time, and therefore that the epistle was written at that period of time as well. Now, if it's difficult to understand exactly when this book was written, it's even more difficult sometimes to understand who wrote it. Now, on the surface, it should be very simple. Obviously, Jude wrote the book of Jude. But who, in fact, was Jude? Jude is an anglicized version of the Greek Judas, which is also similar to the Hebrew Judah, and of course, Jerusalem is in the land of Judah, so the name is not uncommon. In fact, there are 6 people named Judas acknowledged in the New Testament. There are 2 acknowledged as apostles. One was Judas Iscariot, who died about the same time that Jesus was crucified, so he obviously was not the author of this epistle. And the second was another apostle, also by the name of Jude. Now, one of the problems with this is the fact that in those days, people had no trouble changing names. And this is evident if you read the text. For instance, in Matthew chapter 10, the text reads as this. Now the names of the 12 apostles were these. First Simon, who was also called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. There's no sign in that of a second Judas. However, if you go over to the book of Luke, chapter 6, talking about the 12 apostles, it names them thus. Then he chose 12 whom he also named apostles, Simon, whom he also named Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John, Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called the Zealot, Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who also became a traitor. The Gospel of John mirrors the Gospel of Luke in naming 2 apostles Judas. The Gospel of Mark mirrors the Gospel of Matthew and names only 1 apostle Judas. So the consensus is evident that the name of Thaddeus in Matthew and Mark was also the Judas of Luke and John, therefore using 2 different names. This is not uncommon. Simon, called Peter, sometimes called Simon Peter, sometimes called Simon, sometimes called Peter. And in the book of Acts, on Paul's journeys, he takes someone called John with him, who is sometimes called John Mark, and sometimes called Mark. So this becomes difficult, sometimes determining who really is who. So we have difficulty choosing the exact Judas. Then look at James, because Judas, the author of the book of Jude, describes himself as a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. So who is James? Well, if you look at the names of the apostles again in the books, it gives 2 James. James and John, brothers, and James, the son of Alphaeus. both apostles and both in the Gospels. So, who is the James? Some people, Barnes in particular, has said that the second James was also the James who became the author of the book of Jude, or the brother of the author of the book of Jude. The problem with this is that these were apostles while Christ was still living. And if you look at the Bible carefully, you'll see that in John 7, verse 5, it states that even his brothers, this is talking about Jesus, even his brothers did not believe in him. And Matthew 13, verse 57 says, so they, the Pharisees, were offended with him, saying, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. So his brothers and sisters did not believe in him until after the resurrection. And therefore it's difficult to understand how one of the apostles when he was living could be the brother of the Judas and the brother of Christ. However, if you look further in the Bible, there are times when people question who Jesus was. And it says in Matthew 13:55, when Jesus was out preaching and his family came to help him, someone said, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with him? This is also repeated in Mark chapter 6. So there are other people named Judas and James in the New Testament who are brothers of Christ, or stepbrothers of Christ. The whole idea of who this James is difficult sometimes to interpret if you look at a lot of different commentaries. But overall, the appearance seems to be this. There was a man named Judas who was an apostle, who was not the author of the book of Jude. There were also two apostles named James, one of whom, James, the brother of John, who was killed by King Herod early on in the time of the church. In Acts 12, verse 2, it says, he, Herod, killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. The other James, who was an apostle, could not have been the brother of Christ if Christ's brothers did not believe in him until after the resurrection. And after the resurrection, there was no doubt his brothers came to believe fully in him. That James, who was his brother and listed in Matthew 13:55, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And it is quite likely that this brother Judas, mentioned at that time, is the one who wrote the book of Jude. So why does he not say that he's a brother of Christ rather than a brother of James? There are a number of indications why. One is the fact that James, the brother, was also very humble. He was never one to put himself out in the front. And therefore, he may have felt, because James was a leader of the church, that being recognized as a brother of James was sufficient. Also, perhaps he didn't want to go on the sort of coattails of Jesus and use his name as a reference. It's difficult to know. The only way to find out for sure would be to ask Jude himself, and that of course is impossible. The only reference to Jude in the Bible, in the book of Jude, is the first line of verse 1, which says he's a servant of Jesus Christ and a brother of James. Well, the James we've just discussed. Why does he call himself a servant of Christ? Because a servant was very common in those days, or a slave was very common in those days. And it was not uncommon for a slave to be freed after a period of time by the master and become what is known as a bondservant or a bondslave. A person who is free but yet remains in servitude to the master. And Jude is saying by this that he's a servant of Christ, that he is a free man, free to make his decisions, free to go his own way, but he voluntarily becomes a servant, a slave for the cause of Jesus Christ. That's why he's called a servant of Christ as well as a brother of James. The whole situation that people can use different names makes it difficult sometimes to follow the story the way it should be done. In addition, there are some churches who don't believe that Mary had any children after the birth of Christ, that she remained chaste. Now, if that's the case, then the brothers of Jesus Christ could only be accounted for by one of two ways. Either Joseph had children by an earlier marriage before he married Mary, and there is no evidence that I can find anywhere, certainly not in the Bible, that suggests this, or that the brothers of Jesus Christ, as mentioned in the Bible, were actually not blood brothers, but either were cousins, or were nephews, or were somebody very close that they just called brothers and sisters. And this is something which is hard to really prove or disprove. It's possible. People today in churches call each other brother and sister without having any blood relationships. But the Bible does say that these were brothers of Christ. And therefore we should just accept what the Bible says and accept the fact that Jesus had half-brothers and half-sisters in the form of the ones that were mentioned, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, as well as sisters. And therefore, if you take that, then the Judas who wrote the book of Jude was the brother, half-brother of Christ, and James, who became the leader of the church in Jerusalem, also was an associate, a brother of Jesus Christ. That's the most logical way and the most easy way to interpret what the Bible is saying. But it's difficult. Nothing is really as obvious as it seems. As likewise, if you get into next week, we get into the who, to whom the Bible was written, to whom this book was written, it also becomes a controversy. It doesn't become just as simple as is stated in the word itself. Anyway, I hope that helps explain who wrote the book of Jude, and we'll leave it there. We'll come back next time and determine to whom the book was written and start in the book of Jude per se. Thank you for being with me. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.